In the 1st century BCE, the boundaries between personal life and statecraft were virtually non-existent among the ruling elite. Marriage, particularly among the aristocracy and imperial family, was not a union of affection, but an act of political engineering. Each bride was a living treaty, her body a vessel for alliances, her offspring the currency of power. In Rome, in Egypt, in the courts of Parthia, marriage was a tool sharpened by strategy and cruelty. The woman at the center of this chapter was young, barely past her teenage years, when her life was taken from her and placed upon the scales of imperial ambition. She was not chosen for her virtues, her wit, or her voice. She was chosen because her father commanded legions, and her uncle controlled grain shipments that could feed or starve half a province. Her hand was the key to securing both. Her wedding took place in the capital, in a hall where marble gleamed cold under torchlight. Senators and generals filled the space, each wearing the mask of solemn approval. The marriage was announced as a celebration, yet everyone in attendance understood its true purpose. The groom was decades older, a man who had campaigned across deserts and mountains, whose victories had drowned villages in blood. He was loyal to the emperor, but not loyal enough. This marriage would change that. In the traditions of her people, a bride's consent was not a matter of legal requirement. A nod from her guardian was enough to seal her fate. On the day of the ceremony, her guardian, in this case her father, stood beside her, his hand firm on her shoulder as the vows were recited. She was silent, her eyes lowered, her words unheard. It made no difference. The marriage contract was long and precise. It detailed the dowry in coin land and slaves. It listed the rights of inheritance, the obligations of the wife to bear legitimate heirs, and the legal authority of the husband to discipline her. Discipline, in the language of the time, could mean confinement, public humiliation, or physical punishment. The law permitted it. The culture endorsed it. Behind the ceremonial language, the reality was harsher still. The groom's household was not merely a private residence, it was a fortress of loyalty to the empire. His slaves were former soldiers, his steward a former executioner. The bride entered this world as a subordinate, not as a partner. Her quarters were guarded not for her protection, but to ensure she did not flee. Such marriages were never free from political risk. A bride could become a pawn in larger games, suspected of disloyalty if her family's fortunes shifted. In the case of this young woman, suspicion came quickly. Within a year of her marriage, her father's political standing faltered. Grain shipments were delayed, legions redeployed without his approval. The emperor saw these as acts of defiance, and the punishment was subtle but devastating. The bride was watched more closely, her correspondence censored, her servants replaced by spies loyal to her husband. It was common in these circumstances for a wife to become a hostage within her own home. The husband, bound by both loyalty and fear, treated her less as a spouse and more as collateral. Meals were eaten under the eyes of guards. Letters to her mother never reached their destination. At night, she could hear the footsteps of watchmen outside her chamber door. The cultural framework made resistance nearly impossible. Roman law allowed a man to kill his wife without trial if she was caught in adultery, and suspicion alone could be enough to justify confinement or worse. In some provinces, customs were even harsher. A disobedient wife could be returned to her family in disgrace, stripped of her dowry and any claim to her children. For the elite, the loss of children was not only a personal tragedy, but the erasure of a political legacy. For this woman, the breaking point came not through violence, but through ceremony. 2 years into the marriage, her husband was ordered to swear renewed loyalty to the emperor. The ritual took place in the same hall where their wedding had been held. She stood beside him as he pledged not only his service, but the service of his entire household. When the emperor's representative asked for her own vow, she hesitated. That pause, no longer than a breath, was noted by all present. From that moment, she was marked. The household guards were doubled. Her movements were restricted to 3 rooms. Her husband no longer addressed her directly, speaking instead through intermediaries. When political tensions rose again between her father's faction and the imperial court, she was removed entirely from the capital. Sent to a remote estate where the walls were higher than the trees, the estate became her prison. The staff were loyal to her husband. Even the women who dressed her hair were instructed to report on her words. The isolation was absolute. In winter, when supplies were slow to arrive, hunger became another instrument of control. Letters she tried to smuggle out were intercepted. Those who attempted to help her, a kitchen servant, a visiting merchant, disappeared from the estate entirely. History does not record her thoughts during those years, but the records of others in similar positions tell of despair, illness, and a slow erosion of identity. Some wives in her situation turned to religion, seeking protection from household gods or distant deities. Others simply ceased speaking, their silence a final act of defiance in a world that denied them choice. Her story ended without ceremony. No chronicler recorded her death, only the political consequences. When her father finally fell from power, stripped of titles and exiled, her marriage was annulled by imperial decree. Her dowry was confiscated, her property absorbed into the husband's estate. Whether she lived in obscurity or died soon after is unknown. What is certain is that she vanished from the historical record as completely as if she had never existed. By the middle years of the reign, the empire was restless. Borders stretched far beyond what its administrators could manage, and the provinces bled under heavy taxation to fund the ambitions of its rulers. The emperor's most trusted generals were given extraordinary powers, powers that blurred the line between military command and personal sovereignty. Among these men stood the husband of the young woman whose marriage had once been a political instrument. He was no longer merely a general. He was a man who saw himself as the living embodiment of imperial will. When the emperor ordered the suppression of a rebellious kingdom to the east, he accepted with something more than duty. This was an opportunity, not only to secure the frontier, but to cement his own position in the imperial hierarchy. The campaign began with overwhelming force. Columns of infantry marched beside siege engines, their iron fittings catching the sun. Supply trains carried grain, oil, and wine seized from other provinces, for the war was to be paid for by the empire's own subjects. Alongside the soldiers came engineers, scribes, and executioners. Each had a role to play in the machinery of conquest. The targeted kingdom had resisted imperial rule for generations. Its fortresses were carved into hillsides, its people bound together by a fierce devotion to their independence. The general's orders were clear, not only to defeat the enemy, but to ensure they could never rise again. This meant not simply defeating armies, but dismantling the very foundations of their society. The first city to fall was taken after a siege lasting 38 days. Hunger broke the defenders long before the walls did. When the gates opened, there was no negotiation, no mercy. The soldiers entered in disciplined ranks, cutting down any who resisted. Temples were looted, their sacred objects paraded before the troops. The priests were executed in the central square, their bodies left on display for days. From there, the campaign became a march of calculated devastation. Crops were burned before harvest. Wells were poisoned with animal carcasses. Those who surrendered were enslaved. Those who resisted were crucified along the roads leading to the next city, their bodies serving as a warning. The number of the dead is unknown, but contemporary accounts speak of fields littered with bones. Humiliation was as much a weapon as the sword. Captured leaders were not simply executed. They were forced to kneel in chains before the general's tribunal, stripped of their titles. Their children taken as hostages. Women of noble families were given as gifts. To the general's officers, their fates sealed in an instant. These acts were not violations of military law, they were its enforcement. To the empire, resistance was treason, and treason demanded not only death but obliteration. As the months passed, resistance crumbled. Villages surrendered at the first sight of the imperial banners. Markets emptied as traders fled. Entire populations were marched from their homes and resettled in distant provinces where they would be easier to control. The kingdom ceased to exist as a political entity, absorbed into the machinery of the empire. The general's return to the capital was staged as a triumph. The roads were lined with citizens, their cheers echoing through streets hung with garlands. But behind the gilded chariot rolled carts laden not with gold, but with the spoils of a broken culture, stolen statues, plundered manuscripts, and prisoners forced to walk in chains. Among them were the last rulers of the conquered kingdom, their once proud faces marked by exhaustion and humiliation. It was in this atmosphere that the seeds of the next cruelty were sown. Victory had not satisfied the general's hunger, it had sharpened it. In the conquered lands, he had learned that fear could bend entire nations to his will. Now, he sought to bring that same fear into the very heart of the empire. Beginning with his own household, the soldiers who returned with him carried more than loot. They carried stories of domination, of towns made to kneel, of enemies stripped of all dignity. These men became his personal guards, his enforcers. In the capital, they were not bound by the codes that restrained ordinary citizens. They were loyal only to him, and loyalty was rewarded with license. Within the palace, the atmosphere shifted. Servants spoke in whispers. Courtiers who had once treated the general with cautious respect now approached him with overt deference, aware that his power rested not only in his military title, but in the loyalty of men who had learned to kill without hesitation. The same tactics that had broken a kingdom, isolation, humiliation, and calculated displays of violence, began to appear behind palace doors. It was a dangerous moment for the empire. The general's victories made him indispensable to the emperor, but also dangerous. A man who commanded absolute loyalty from his troops could, if he wished, command the throne itself. To prevent this, the emperor tightened his grip, summoning the general more frequently to court, involving him in the politics of succession, and surrounding him with spies. Yet, those measures could not erase the mark the campaign had left on the general's mind. He had seen entire cultures broken and remade in his image. He had come to believe that control was not maintained through law or tradition, but through the constant application of fear. This belief would soon reach its most personal expression, not in distant battlefields, but in the chambers where his wife still lived in guarded seclusion. In the months after his return, he visited her more often, but not as a husband seeking reconciliation. Instead, his presence was that of a conqueror inspecting a captured city. Servants reported that he would speak of the campaign in detail, describing the sieges, the executions, the way he had forced enemy leaders to bow. Sometimes he would pause, as if inviting her to understand that these stories were not only about the past. The war had ended on the empire's frontiers, but within the palace, a quieter war was beginning, one that would claim no cities, but would destroy lives with equal finality. The general had brought conquest home, and those within his reach would learn what it meant to live under the rule of a man who believed that mercy was weakness. In the days before a coronation, an imperial palace became the center of the world. Envoys arrived from distant provinces, bearing gifts that proclaimed loyalty or concealed ambition. The courtyards smelled of incense and fresh-cut cedar, while the air hummed with the rehearsals of musicians and the murmurs of priests perfecting the sacred rites. The impending crowning of the general's wife, a woman long kept in guarded seclusion, was presented as a renewal of imperial unity, a symbol that victory abroad had restored harmony within. The announcement had been met with calculated enthusiasm by the court. Some saw it as a move to consolidate the general's influence, others as a concession from the emperor meant to bind a dangerous man more closely to the throne. But for the woman herself, it was neither triumph nor reconciliation. It was a performance, staged for the empire's benefit, with her as its most visible prop. By the final night before the ceremony, preparations had reached their height. The palace corridors glowed with the light of oil lamps set in bronze holders shaped like eagles. Servants moved in steady lines, carrying bolts of silk, polished armor, and trays of jeweled cups. In the great hall, foreign dignitaries feasted, raising toasts to the coming reign. Wine flowed freely, first to the honored guests, then to the officers who had returned with the general from his eastern campaign. It was here, amid the noise and drink, that the boundary between celebration and lawlessness began to blur. These soldiers had been forged in the brutal discipline of conquest, but they had also been given license by their commander to act as they pleased in victory. On foreign soil, that meant cities sacked and captives taken. Within the palace, the same hunger for domination sought new targets. The woman who would be crowned at dawn was the most visible symbol of the general's triumph. In the minds of the men who had fought under him, she was not merely his wife. She was a prize of war, an embodiment of the empire they had helped him secure, and in a culture that often equated military glory with the subjugation of women, that symbolism carried a dangerous weight. By midnight, the palace guards, many of them veterans of the campaign, had abandoned their posts for the feasting halls. The corridors leading to the women's quarters, once rigidly patrolled, stood unmonitored. Witnesses later claimed that the general himself had given an unspoken permission, not in words, but in the deliberate absence of orders. Within her chambers, the woman was attended by a handful of personal servants, arranging the ceremonial garments she would wear for the coronation. These robes, woven with threads of gold, had been sent from the eastern provinces as tribute. Each fold represented weeks of work, each pattern a symbol of imperial authority. Outside the heavy doors, the sound of distant singing gave no warning of what was to come. The intrusion began quietly. A pair of soldiers entered under the pretense of delivering a final security inspection. Their arrival was unusual but not alarming. The palace was full of strange movements that night. But moments later, more followed. A small group, their armor loose, their movements unsteady with drink. The servants froze, unsure whether to challenge them or flee. The accounts that survive do not describe the details of what happened in that room. They speak instead in the language of omission. Servants dismissed under vague orders, the sound of bolts drawn across the inside of the door, the silence that followed for hours. When the doors opened again, the soldiers emerged laughing quietly among themselves, their faces untroubled by any fear of consequence. In the imperial court, such acts were not always crimes in the way modern law would define them. A woman's body, particularly the body of a wife bound to a powerful man, was often seen as an extension of his household, and therefore subject to his authority. If the general viewed the night's events as acceptable, no legal complaint could stand against those who had taken part. Silence was both the law and the custom. By dawn, the palace was once again a stage for ritual. The corridors were swept, the lamps trimmed, the musicians positioned. In the great hall, dignitaries assembled in their finest robes, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the night's events. The woman appeared at her appointed time, robed and veiled, the crown's weight pressing against her brow. If she bore any mark of what had occurred hours earlier, it was hidden beneath the ceremonial layers and the rigid stillness of her posture. The coronation proceeded without interruption. Priests invoked the gods, nobles offered pledges. The general stood beside her with the practiced gravity of a man accustomed to public ceremony. Yet, for those who knew how to read the silences of the court, the absence of her family from the front ranks, the downcast eyes of her remaining servants, and the tightened expressions of certain ministers told another story. This was the true nature of power in the empire. Not only the ability to command armies, but the ability to decide which acts would be remembered and which would be erased. In the official chronicles, the coronation was recorded as a day of unity, marked by the presence of foreign envoys and the renewal of imperial vows. There was no mention of the night before. Yet, the consequences of that night would not be so easily contained. In the months that followed, rumors spread quietly among the court's lower ranks. Servants, guards, and minor officials whose duties placed them near the edges of power. Some whispered that the general had orchestrated the event as a final humiliation, a message to both his wife and the emperor that her dignity, like the dignity of the conquered, existed only by his permission. Others claimed it had been an uncontrolled act of drunken violence, one he tolerated rather than punished. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. The woman's public role diminished after the coronation. She was seen less frequently in the court, her appearances limited to the most formal occasions. Her voice in political matters, already constrained, was silenced entirely. The title of empress became, for her, another form of captivity, one gilded with ceremony, but hollow in authority. If the shadows of the past fascinate you, and you crave more stories buried in darkness and mystery, hit that subscribe button now. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss an ancient secret revealed. And if this story sent chills down your spine, drop a comment below. Tell me which part disturbed you the most. Also, let me know where you're from and what time you're watching from. I love seeing how far these dark stories reach. The night before the coronation had not been a secret. Servants spoke of it in hushed tones before dawn, guards traded glances when their shifts changed, and certain ministers, those who had served long enough to read the undercurrents of power, understood immediately what it meant. The event had not been a lapse in discipline. It had been an act of deliberate permission. In the hierarchy of the empire, law was an extension of the ruler's will. The emperor and his chosen generals did not merely enforce the law, they embodied it. A woman's protection, even a crowned empress, existed only insofar as the men above her allowed it. In that context, the assault was not an aberration. It was a demonstration. The emperor had sanctioned the general's dominance, and the general, in turn, had allowed his soldiers to make the statement for him. The statement was clear: her body was not her own. It belonged first to the household, then to the state. As a wife, she was an extension of her husband's honor. As an empress, she was a living emblem of imperial authority. Both statuses placed her in the same position, an object to be displayed, guarded, or violated depending on the needs of power. No guard intervened because no guard was meant to. The corridors to her chambers had been left unpatrolled not by accident, but by omission. In the rigid order of palace service, every absence was noticed and recorded. That night, no records were kept. The guard logs contained no mention of the soldiers who entered her rooms, no note of the time they emerged. The official version of the night was one of uninterrupted preparation for the coronation. Among the ministers, there was no formal protest. To speak against the act would have been to accuse the general, and by extension the emperor himself, of condoning it. Such an accusation was not a path to justice but to ruin. Those who had dared to challenge the imperial household in the past had met with exile, confiscation of property, or execution. Silence was not merely fear, it was survival. Even the religious authorities, who were charged with guarding the sanctity of the imperial marriage, said nothing. In private, some may have condemned the act, but publicly, the temple offered blessings as if nothing had occurred. In the theology of the state cult, the ruler's will was divinely sanctioned. To question it was to question the gods themselves. For the empress, the aftermath was a second violation, one of erasure. The court resumed its duties without pause, the coronation proceeding as planned. No physician was sent to her chambers. No words of condolence were spoken in the hearing of others. The event was buried under layers of ceremony, as though ritual could overwrite memory. This form of violence, public in knowledge, private in acknowledgement, was not unique to her. Throughout the empire's history, women bound to power had suffered the same treatment. Some were attacked by rivals to humiliate their husbands. Others were offered as rewards to secure political loyalty. In each case, the act was less about personal desire than about demonstrating dominance, reminding all who witnessed it that the victim's body was a tool of statecraft. In conquered provinces, such practices were common enough to be expected. Victors claimed the daughters and wives of defeated rulers, parading them in chains or taking them into their households as concubines. In the capital, the forms were more elaborate, but the principle was the same. The empire did not differentiate between the spoils of war and the symbols of domestic authority. Both were trophies. Her coronation the next morning was therefore not a contradiction, but a continuation of the same message. She stood beside her husband, crowned in gold, while the memory of the previous night lingered unspoken between them. The crown was not a shield. It was a sign that she had survived the test of endurance the empire demanded of those who wore it. The political meaning of the assault extended beyond her. It reminded the court that the general's authority reached into the most intimate spaces of the palace. It warned foreign envoys that loyalty to the empire meant submission to its customs, however brutal. and it told the emperor's rivals that even those who seemed untouchable could be touched. Not in secrecy, but in view of the entire hierarchy that would refuse to name the act for what it was. No formal record of the event survives, but the silences in the chronicles speak clearly. In the official histories, her reign as empress begins with the coronation, untainted by scandal. The palace archives contain no petitions for justice, no imperial decrees addressing misconduct. The absence is deliberate. To write the truth would have been to grant it permanence, to admit that it happened. In this way, the empire protected itself from the burden of moral reckoning. It was easier to erase an act from the record than to confront the questions it raised about the nature of its power. For the court, the soldiers were not criminals. They were instruments. The crime was not a violation of law, because the law itself had bent to accommodate it. This was the reality she inhabited, a world in which the same system that proclaimed her sovereignty over provinces could strip her of sovereignty over her own body, a world in which violence was not a collapse of order, but one of its most enduring tools. The lesson was not lost on her. She understood now, more than ever, that survival in the palace meant mastering the same language of silence that had been used against her. Words could not shield her. Protests could not protect her. Only the careful navigation of power, the same skill that had kept weaker ministers alive, offered any hope. But survival came at a cost. Each day that passed without justice confirmed the empire's belief that its rulers were beyond morality. Each act that went unchallenged set a precedent for the next. And in the shadow of the coronation, the precedent had been set in the most public way possible. The first light of dawn did not enter her chambers as warmth. It came as an intrusion, cutting across the remnants of a night that the palace had already decided to forget. By the time the court attendants entered, the decision had been made. The woman who would stand before the empire that day would bear no trace of what had been done to her. The bathing was ritual, but its meaning had shifted. In the empire's ceremonial code, the morning ablution before coronation was meant to purify the body for sacred duty. Now it served a second purpose, to wash away evidence. The women assigned to the task worked in silence, their eyes fixed on the basin, not on her. They knew their role was not to comfort, but to prepare. No words of condolence were spoken. The attendants were bound by palace discipline, trained to treat the body before them as an extension of the imperial household, not as a person in pain. Their loyalty was to the office, not to the individual. Any acknowledgement of the night before would have been an act of disloyalty, a violation of the unspoken law that what served the empire's image must be preserved, and what threatened it must be erased. The cosmetics were applied with the precision of a military operation. Pigments concealed discoloration, powders dulled the evidence of sleeplessness. Layers of silk and embroidered brocade covered the marks left on her skin. In the mirror, the transformation was near complete. Where there had been a victim, there now appeared the image of a ruler's consort. Serene, untouched, immaculate. This was the empire's skill, the ability to overwrite reality with performance. Ceremony was not merely spectacle, it was a mechanism of control. Every robe, every ornament, every bow from a servant reinforced the idea that what the court witnessed was truth. The body could suffer in private, the image could not. The veil was lowered last. In the court's tradition, it symbolized modesty and divine favor. Today it served another function, to obscure her expression from the thousands who would watch. Behind the fine weave, she could look at her audience without granting them access to her eyes. Her route to the ceremonial hall took her through corridors heavy with incense. Priests moved in orderly processions, chanting blessings that spoke of virtue, fidelity, and harmony in marriage. The irony was invisible to all but her. These words were not meant for her comfort. They were part of the ritual apparatus that would legitimize the day's proceedings. Everywhere, the machinery of the state moved with precision. Guards lined the passageways in immaculate armor, their faces impassive. Ministers in formal robes awaited their cue to bow. Musicians tuned their instruments for the fanfares that would announce her arrival. To an outsider, the morning was one of perfection. To her, it was a stage built over the ruins of her dignity. In the logic of the palace, this transformation from wounded woman to ceremonial figure was not hypocrisy. It was duty. The individual's suffering did not outweigh the needs of the state. The empire's stability depended on symbols, and her coronation was a symbol of continuity, unity, and divine sanction. Any disruption, no matter how justified, was considered a threat to the whole. Even the chroniclers, who would one day write of this morning, understood their role. Their scrolls would record the splendor of her robes, the eloquence of the blessings, the harmony of the music. They would omit the silence that had followed the previous night. The past was malleable in the hands of the record keepers. Memory could be shaped to match the image the state required. Her husband stood waiting in the ceremonial hall. In his expression there was no trace of acknowledgement, not of the assault, not of her endurance, not of the reality they both knew. His gaze passed over her as if she were a piece of regalia being inspected for flaws. To him, the purpose of the morning was clear: to present his consort to the empire as an unblemished embodiment of imperial power. When she took her place beside him, the court erupted in ritual prostrations. Officials pressed their foreheads to the polished floor. Envoys from distant lands bowed low in the prescribed gestures of respect. From their perspective, they were witnessing an unbroken chain of imperial majesty. None could see the fracture beneath the surface. The coronation rites unfolded as they had for generations. Incense burned in braziers, the air thick with its cloying sweetness. Musicians played melodies that had accompanied rulers for centuries. Sacred texts were recited, invoking the blessings of the ancestors upon the new empress. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of tradition. Indifferent to the truth of her condition, her crown was placed upon her head by the chief priest, a circlet of gold set with gemstones large enough to catch the light of the hall's lanterns. The weight of it was real, pressing into her scalp, but it was the invisible weight of silence that she felt most keenly. In that moment, the empire declared her elevated, honored, revered. She knew otherwise. To the court, the morning was a triumph. The rituals had been executed flawlessly, the symbols maintained, the image preserved. To her, it was a performance in which she had been given no choice but to play her part. Her voice was absent from the ceremony, her pain absent from the record, her truth absent from the history being inscribed even as the rites unfolded. When the final prayers were spoken and the court bowed once more, she understood that this morning had not erased the night before. It had buried it. Beneath the weight of gold, silk, and ritual, the violence remained, unacknowledged but unforgotten. The coronation was not a beginning, but a seal placed over a wound the empire would never admit existed. The crown, once lowered onto her head, did not belong to her. In the logic of the empire, regalia belonged to the state, not the wearer. It was a repository of power, the embodiment of the ruler's authority, and a visible declaration of the people's submission. For the woman who bore it, it was also a restraint, one that bound her to a role she had not chosen and could not abandon. Its weight was not merely physical. The filigree and gemstones pressed into her scalp were less oppressive than the expectation it carried to embody grace, stability, and loyalty before the eyes of the court and the provinces beyond. The empire had decided that her body, marked by the soldiers' cruelty, would serve as the stage for its own image of perfection. To falter even slightly would be interpreted as defiance. From the balconies above the ceremonial hall, envoys and ministers studied her posture with the same scrutiny given to the emperor himself. In their eyes, her stillness signaled discipline, her lowered gaze modesty. They did not know, or pretended not to know, that each of these movements was calculated to hide the tension in her limbs, the memory in her muscles. The crown's power lay in its ability to redefine her suffering as irrelevant. By placing it upon her head, the empire had rewritten her story. She was no longer a victim, she was an empress, and an empress could not be wronged in the same way a woman could. Within the court's ideology, to harm the emperor's consort was unthinkable, unless the act was sanctioned, in which case it ceased to be considered harm at all. This transformation of reality through symbol was not accidental. It was a deliberate act of governance. The ministers who arranged the coronation understood that the spectacle would close the matter in the eyes of the public. The empire's people, scattered across distant provinces, would hear only that the coronation had been magnificent, that the empress had smiled upon the crowd, and that harmony had been restored. Outside the capital, news traveled along the empire's official channels. Proclamations recited in marketplaces, inscriptions posted at city gates. Each described her robes in detail, praised her composure, and affirmed her devotion to the emperor. No mention was made of the soldiers who had returned from campaign with victory in one hand and her dignity in the other. For the court, her survival was useful, but not for her own sake. A broken consort could not anchor the legitimacy of the throne, a composed one could. She was expected to appear alongside the emperor at processions, banquets, and councils, each appearance reinforcing the image of unity. To the empire's subjects, her presence suggested that the ruler's household was unshaken, the palace secure, and the gods still in favor of the dynasty. The demands placed upon her were unrelenting. Every smile to the assembled crowd was an act of survival, each bow of her head a calculation. The court's etiquette manuals prescribed precise angles for gestures, exact timing for responses, even the spacing of her steps in ceremonial walks. Deviation from these norms could provoke suspicion. Suspicion could provoke investigation, and investigation could end with her disappearance from both the palace and the historical record. The emperor's gaze, whether in public or private, was a reminder that her role was not negotiable. He did not need to repeat the events of the night before. The knowledge that he could sanction such acts again was sufficient to keep her within the boundaries set for her. The crown on her head was both proof of her elevation and a constant signal of her captivity. The empire's chroniclers would later write of her as a model of imperial dignity. They would praise her composure in times of political turbulence, her ability to soothe tensions between rival factions of the court, and her grace in performing religious rites. None would write of the discipline it took to keep her voice steady when speaking before the same officials who had stood silent while she was violated. Her isolation was absolute. Within the palace, every servant was bound by an oath that prohibited personal speech with the empress outside prescribed circumstances. Ministers addressed her only in ritualized forms, never in private conversation. Even the women assigned to her chambers were rotated frequently, preventing the formation of alliances. Such measures were framed as protection, but they served equally well to contain and control. The public ceremonies that followed her coronation deepened the erasure. Festivals were held in the capital to honor the victorious army and its ruler. In parades, the soldiers marched with polished weapons and plundered treasures, greeted with cheers from the populace. She rode in a gilded carriage beside the emperor, her face composed, her crown gleaming in the sunlight. The crowd's admiration was genuine, but it was for an image, not for the truth. Every cheer from the street was a reminder of how effectively the empire could reshape reality. The people celebrated the army's glory without knowing that its most recent conquest had been within the palace itself. The soldiers' violence had not diminished their honor. It had been absorbed into the fabric of imperial power, transformed from crime into silence. The crown thus became a weapon twice over. It was a tool of statecraft, ensuring her compliance through the weight of duty, and it was a shield for the perpetrators, obscuring their acts behind the splendor of her role. In wearing it, she became both a symbol of the empire's stability and a living concealment of its cruelty. As months passed, she mastered the performance the crown demanded. Her voice in ceremony carried the exact resonance expected of an empress. Her smiles reached the corners of her mouth without touching her eyes. Her movements in ritual dances were flawless, each step in accordance with ancient precedent. To the unknowing, she was the embodiment of imperial grace. To herself, she was a woman surviving in plain sight. The empire would not punish her for private grief, but it would punish her for making that grief visible. In this way, the crown policed her as effectively as any guard. It was not simply a reminder of her captivity, it was the very instrument that enforced it. The first whispers did not come from the outer city. They began inside the palace walls, among those whose duties required them to pass silently through its corridors. Servants carrying trays avoided certain halls after dark. Guards who had once greeted her with formal deference now kept their eyes lowered longer than etiquette demanded. These were not open acts of defiance, nor were they expressions of sympathy. They were acknowledgments, fleeting, careful, that they had seen what should not be spoken. The palace was a labyrinth of surveillance. Words were never exchanged without the awareness that someone, somewhere, could carry them to the wrong ears. It was safer to communicate in fragments, a hesitation before a bow, the subtle tightening of a jaw, the way a hand lingered for a moment longer when offering a goblet. The language of the court was not confined to speech. It thrived in gestures invisible to outsiders. Beyond her chambers, the noble families also knew. They learned of the event not through official proclamation. Such things were never announced, but through the invisible network that connected every corner of the empire's elite. A favored servant dismissed unexpectedly, a change in the empress's attendance, a cancelled private audience, each piece was a thread, and together they wove a pattern the nobles could read. In the capital, such patterns were more reliable than decrees. Every great family kept its own agents in the palace, from kitchen boys to scribes, each tasked with gathering fragments of information. To the families, her suffering was not merely a personal matter, it was a sign of how the emperor intended to govern his household, and by extension, the empire. Yet knowing was not the same as acting. To speak of it was to risk everything. The empire's laws treated slander against the emperor or his household as treason, and treason had no lesser punishment than death. Even a question asked in the wrong company could end in exile, confiscation of property, or execution. The noble houses weighed their indignation against their survival and found silence the wiser course. This silence was not uniform. Behind closed doors, in guarded courtyards, some families allowed themselves the language of pity, while others spoke only in political terms. For them, her humiliation was not an isolated act of cruelty, but a calculated display, a reminder to all that the emperor's will extended into every sphere, that even the most honored in the land were not beyond reach. In her chambers, the knowledge of this unspoken awareness was both a comfort and a burden. She could feel it in the way certain ministers looked at her during ceremonies, a fleeting glance that seemed to hold a question they dared not voice. She could sense it in the way her attendants hesitated before dressing her for public appearances, as though their hands carried a weight that clothing could not hide. The silence was not passive, it had structure, maintained by the machinery of the empire. The master of ceremonies ensured that her appearances followed one another in quick succession, leaving little opportunity for private interaction. The scribes who recorded court events omitted details that might suggest anything other than harmony. In official portraits, she was painted with serene eyes and unbroken poise, her image sent to the provinces as proof of imperial stability. Every element of her life became part of this deliberate forgetting. The gardens where she walked were always arranged to be visible from certain balconies, so that her composure could be witnessed by passing courtiers. Her voice in prayer during religious rites was amplified by the temple's architecture, a sonic reassurance that the empress still fulfilled her duties. The palace did not erase her, it remade her into the version it required. Among the servants, the whispers carried another layer of danger. They spoke in kitchens over steaming vats, in laundry rooms where the noise of washing muffled sound, in stables where the scent of animals discouraged the presence of noble company. Yet even there, the talk was guarded. Names were not spoken. Events were described only in metaphor. A broken vase might be said to have been dropped by the emperor's own hand. A storm in the night might refer not to weather, but to the violence that had passed through her chambers. Such coded speech was a survival skill. Everyone in the palace knew that informants could be anywhere. A junior scribe, a wine steward, even a fellow servant. Information was currency, and in a court where favor could be won or lost in a single audience, many were willing to sell what they knew. The emperor himself did not address the matter, either in public or in private. His silence was not ignorance, it was ownership. By refusing to acknowledge the violence, he ensured that it remained an unchallengeable act of imperial will. To speak of it was to deny that the emperor's will was beyond morality, and that was an offense the empire would not forgive. This was the paradox she lived. With the more widely known her suffering became within the palace, the more impossible it was to speak of it. Knowledge without voice became another form of control. It was as though the entire court conspired to carry a secret that belonged to no one but was guarded by all, and so the rumors remained where they began, in the corridors, the kitchens, the private halls of the noble estates. They grew no louder, but they did not fade. They were a steady hum beneath the daily rituals of governance, a quiet reminder that the empire's magnificence rested on foundations it would never allow to be seen. Her own survival depended on mastering the art of living within this silence. She learned to listen without appearing to listen, to note who avoided her gaze and who held it too long, to read in the stiffness of a bow the measure of a courtier's loyalty. In the empire, power was not always in what was said, but in what was withheld. The emperor did not regard the events of that night as a transgression. In the code by which he ruled, cruelty was not only permissible, it was essential. His authority, he believed, could not be secured by diplomacy alone. It required spectacles, and what greater spectacle than the breaking of a person whose image the empire revered? In council, he spoke of discipline, loyalty, and the obedience of subjects as though they were metals to be forged. He rarely mentioned her by name, but those who listened understood. His language was that of a man who believed possession conferred the right to destroy. To him, she was not separate from the empire. She was part of its territory, a symbol to be displayed, altered, or diminished as he saw fit. The generals, ministers, and envoys around him absorbed this view with practiced nods. Many had built their fortunes on similar calculations, though on a smaller scale. Villages burned to make a border secure, rivals humiliated to ensure allegiance. The emperor's act was simply the imperial version of what they themselves had done. To condemn it would be to admit their own methods were corrupt, and none dared such self-indictment. In private, he justified himself with the language of necessity. The empire, he claimed, was a restless creature, its unity dependent on the fear and respect he inspired. Victory in battle was fleeting. It needed to be reinforced by gestures that could not be mistaken for weakness. Her humiliation, he reasoned, was a lesson both to those who might defy him and to those who served him. That loyalty was not a shield. An honor was a privilege he could revoke at will. When foreign dignitaries met him in the days after the coronation, they found a ruler more assured than ever. He spoke of alliances and tribute with the ease of one who believed himself unassailable. Rumors of the empress's ordeal had reached some of their ears, but in the emperor's presence, the truth of the matter was irrelevant. What mattered was the unspoken understanding, if he could allow such a thing to be done to his own consort. What restraint could they expect toward themselves or their people? The court chroniclers, tasked with preserving the narrative of his reign, adapted their records accordingly. Official accounts omitted any mention of the night before the coronation, but subtle alterations to the sequence of events made his dominance unmistakable. The coronation was framed not as a celebration of unity, but as the culmination of a campaign to consolidate absolute control. The empress was described in the language of loyalty. Her grace, her silence, her composure all presented as virtues of devotion, not signs of coercion. To the emperor, this rewriting was not deceit, it was governance. He believed truth was not a matter of accuracy but of utility. History, in his view, existed to serve the state, and the state was indistinguishable from himself. In moments of candor with his closest advisers, he spoke of her as one might speak of a captured city. There was no malice in his tone, only calculation. A fortress untested cannot inspire fear, he said once, pacing the marble floor of his private audience chamber. When it is taken, and still it stands, its value is doubled. They understood the metaphor. Her public composure was to be his proof. That she could be shattered and yet continue to fulfill her ceremonial role was evidence of both her subjugation and his mastery. To the emperor, this was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a demonstration that no dignity, no tradition, no person was beyond the reach of his will. There were those in his retinue who might have felt unease, though they concealed it well. One or two ministers, seasoned in the politics of other courts, recognized the dangers of a ruler who confused fear with stability. But they had also seen what became of dissenters. The empire did not exile opposition, it consumed it. Any who challenged the emperor's version of events would be destroyed, their families stripped of titles and property, their names erased from the records. So the justification spread outward, carried by those who wished to remain in favor. It took on the tone of doctrine, repeated in speeches, woven into the teachings of imperial tutors, echoed in the conversations of the palace guard. The logic was simple enough for even the lowest-ranking servant to repeat: if the emperor's will was law, then no act committed under that will could be unlawful. This reasoning did not only protect the past, it prepared the future. By framing the assault as a political necessity, the emperor created a precedent for similar actions, should they be needed to reinforce his rule. What had been done once could be done again, to anyone, without apology. In her presence, he behaved as though nothing had changed. At formal events, he addressed her with the courtesy expected between sovereign and consort. In private, his words were few, his demeanor controlled. He neither sought her forgiveness nor offered explanation. For in his mind, there was nothing to forgive, nothing to explain. She listened to his justifications when they reached her through the latticework of palace rumor. She heard them repeated by courtiers with the polished assurance of people quoting a truth beyond question, and she understood then that her suffering had been transformed into a political instrument, one she would be forced to carry, even as it was used to fortify the throne on which she was expected to sit beside him. The emperor's confidence in his own reasoning was absolute. He believed history would vindicate him, that his reign would be remembered not for the moral compromises it demanded, but for the stability it achieved. If the price of that stability was the erasure of her dignity, then in his mind it was a price the empire, and she, ought to pay without complaint. In this conviction, he found reassurance. It allowed him to sleep soundly, to speak of justice without irony, to look upon the empire's banners and see them as extensions of himself. For him, the crown was not merely an ornament of state. It was a weapon, sharpened not by goldsmiths, but by the subjugation of those within his reach. And as long as the court repeated his words, as long as the scribes inscribed his reasoning into the chronicles, as long as no voice dared to rise in open contradiction, his justification would stand unchallenged. The empress learned quickly that survival depended not on open defiance, but on the art of concealment. A word too sharp, a look too direct, could undo her in an instant. The emperor's court was a place where loyalty was measured by obedience, and disobedience, even unspoken, could cost a life. Yet within the narrow confines of her role, she began to carve small spaces for herself, pockets of autonomy invisible to those who believed her broken. Her first act of resistance was deceptively simple. She listened, in the antechambers where noblewomen gossiped, in the corridors where servants exchanged hurried whispers. She absorbed every rumor, every complaint, every half-truth. She never repeated them aloud, but she collected them, storing each fragment like a coin in a hidden purse. Information was not just a weapon, it was a shield, one that could be drawn when the moment was right. She learned which ministers feared losing favor, which generals resented the emperor's growing arrogance, which foreign envoys harbored ambitions that could turn to leverage. None of this knowledge could yet be used, but its very existence gave her a sense of agency. They had taken her body, her public image, even her name in the court's official records. But they could not yet take what she carried in her mind. Her second act of resistance was in the gestures. She began to cultivate a look, a faint, unreadable smile that disarmed the curious and unsettled the guilty. When foreign guests addressed her, she held their gaze a fraction longer than courtesy demanded. To the untrained eye, it was nothing. To those who knew of her ordeal, it was a reminder that she still saw, still remembered. There were allies, though none could openly name themselves as such. A handmaiden who left the window latch unfastened so the queen could feel the night air. A court musician who altered the tune of a ceremonial march to include a melody from her homeland. A foreign princess who, during a state banquet, pressed into her palm a folded scrap of silk embroidered with a single word, endure. These acts were as dangerous for the givers as for her. Discovery would mean exile at best, execution at worst. Yet they came quietly and without fanfare, threads of solidarity woven into the fabric of her days. At times, the weight of caution felt unbearable. She longed to shout the truth into the marble halls, to name each accomplice of her suffering. But she knew the empire was built to absorb such shocks without breaking. Her death would be another page in the chronicles, written in the same ink as the emperor's victories. Survival, she realized, was the only way to deny him the satisfaction of total conquest. And so she began to master the role he had given her. She stood beside him in the throne room, eyes lowered in deference, while her mind wandered through hidden maps of court alliances. She wore the jewels he bestowed upon her, each one a symbol of ownership, and let them catch the light so that no one would see the darkness behind her smile. Her resistance extended to small acts of refusal invisible to all but herself. She withheld certain words in conversation, refusing to praise a policy she knew had been bought with suffering. She allowed certain messages from the emperor to foreign rulers to be delayed, not long enough to cause suspicion, but enough to make his will slightly less absolute. These were risks she calculated carefully. A single misstep could unravel her entirely. On nights when the palace was quiet and the torches burned low, she would sit by her chamber's brazier, the flames casting shadows across her veil, and rehearse conversations that could never take place. She imagined telling the emperor that his power was brittle, that fear could not bind an empire forever. She imagined saying her own name aloud, in her own language, just to remember how it felt in her mouth. Each dawn, she would let those fantasies burn away like smoke. What mattered was the slow work, the careful gathering of allies, the cultivation of her image, the steady survival that denied him the final word. There were moments when she feared she had been fooling herself, that her so-called resistance was only another form of submission. But then a servant would pause a heartbeat too long when pouring her tea, or a noblewoman would slip into a seat beside her at a banquet and mention, with studied casualness, a detail only she could have spread. The ripples of her quiet work were there, faint but undeniable. The emperor noticed changes in her demeanor, though he misread them. He saw her composure as acceptance, her silence as the settling of dust after a storm. This suited her perfectly. The less he suspected, the freer she was to continue her hidden campaign. He still believed he owned her entirely, and so he watched her less closely than he might have otherwise. Her final and most dangerous act of resistance was to keep living in the role they had forced upon her without becoming it. Every smile to the crowd was a lie told in self-defense. Every bow of the head was a blade she turned inward, sparing herself in the moment so she might one day turn it outward. History would not record the tiny victories, the conversation she guided so a foreign emissary would doubt the emperor's sincerity, the small delays in ceremonial decisions that cost him a measure of authority, the quiet solidarity of women in the court who refused to forget what had been done. These moments would vanish into the margins, if they were remembered at all, but she carried them with her, each one a seed she might plant if the soil ever became fertile. Until then, her resistance would remain as it had begun, silent, subtle, and stubborn. She did not know if she would live to see the emperor's fall. She did not know if her efforts would ever reach beyond the palace walls. But she knew this. As long as she could choose even the smallest act that was not dictated by his will, she remained more than his possession, and in a court where everything was claimed by the crown, even that sliver of self was a victory. Long after her voice was stilled, her story traveled without her. It was not written in the empire's official chronicles, which praised the emperor's campaigns and his glorious unification of the lands. No court historian dared record what had been done to her, not the night before her coronation, not the long years after. And yet, in the quiet corners where truth survived, her name became a warning. Mothers told their daughters in hushed tones, "Do not trust the silk, for it can hide the chains." They spoke not of the queen as a figure of state, but as a woman forced to smile beneath a crown that was meant to break her. In their telling, she was neither a saint nor a martyr, but a mirror held up to power, and power's appetite. Travelers carried the whispers beyond the empire's borders. A merchant from the west spoke of a queen whose grace was a mask carved by fear. A nomad from the southern plains swore she had seen the empress once, standing on a balcony, her eyes fixed not on the cheering crowd below, but on the horizon, as if waiting for something far away to return. These accounts shifted in the retelling, embellished with details no one could verify, but their core remained: she had been wronged, and the wrong had been celebrated. The emperor grew old, though not soft. His reign was marked by victories and by the quiet terror of those who lived under him. The palace where she once stood in gold and silk became a monument to obedience. Its marble pillars gleamed, its gardens bloomed, and yet, in certain corners, the stones seemed to carry a weight that even time could not erase. Servants avoided the corridor where the soldiers had been stationed the night before her coronation. Foreign guests noticed the way music faltered, just slightly, when she entered a hall. When the empire finally began to crumble, from drought, from rebellion, from the slow rot that comes when a ruler believes himself immortal, the queen's story did not end. The palace was abandoned to weeds and wind. The banners rotted where they hung. Statues of the emperor toppled, some by the hands of rebels, others by the quiet persistence of weather. But the cruelty that had been crowned alongside him lingered, not in monuments, but in memory. Centuries later, chroniclers pieced together fragments of her life from contradictory sources. In one account, she was a tragic figure who bore her suffering with silent dignity. In another, she was a strategist who manipulated court politics to weaken the emperor's rule. Some claimed she died before him, others swore she outlived him, wandering the ruins of the palace in her later years. None could agree on the details, but all agreed on the shadow her story cast. The ruins themselves became a kind of witness. Travelers wrote of standing in the great throne room, its ceiling open to the sky, and feeling an unease that had nothing to do with the wind or the silence. The walls, they said, seemed to hum with the memory of eyes that had seen too much. Local guides would point to the cracked steps of the coronation days and say, "This is where they placed the crown upon her head." They would lower their voices before adding, "And this is where she stood the night before." When the guards led her away, it was never spoken loudly. Even in the empire's absence, there lingered a superstition, or perhaps a respect, for the story's quiet power. Some rulers who came after the empire's fall tried to erase her entirely. They banned songs that mentioned her, destroyed manuscripts that alluded to her reign, but each attempt only seemed to give the story new life. It slipped into folk tales, into lullabies, into the warnings whispered between women when power shifted hands. In time, her name was no longer tied to a single woman, but to an idea that the cruelty of rulers could be most dangerous when draped in ceremony. She became a cautionary figure, invoked when young brides were sent into the courts of ambitious men, when treaties were sealed with marriages, when crowns glittered too brightly. Her legacy was not one of vengeance. She had been given no weapon sharp enough for that. It was a legacy of endurance, of survival in the face of humiliation intended to annihilate her. And though endurance is quieter than rebellion, it has a way of lingering. The cruelty that tried to define her had outlived the emperor, outlived the empire, and in some ways outlived her. But so too had the knowledge of it, passed down like an heirloom no one wanted but everyone kept. In the end, the empire was reduced to dust and stories. The dust scattered with the wind, the stories remained. Thanks for diving into the shadows of history with me today. Remember, the past isn't always buried quietly. Sometimes, it screams from the depths of time. Until next time, stay curious and beware what secrets lie beneath. See you in the next dark tale.